Okay, so in our previous example, we had talked about the manual skill set. Now, a link to that particular video I will give over here. So you can just check that video out. In this particular example, again, it'll be a continuation of our previous video. We'll talk about the custom scale set. So how the custom scale set is going to work is as follows. We're going to have an initial condition of 2 virtual machines within our custom scale set. And we're going to have a scale in and a scale out policy. So the scale in policy would be something like this. So if the CPU utilization, now again, you can choose other metrics as well, but for our example, we'll choose the CPU utilization. So if the CPU utilization of these 2 particular virtual machines goes below a certain threshold, so the threshold that we choose would be 50%, then this particular custom scale set will scale in. So that is, instead of 2 instances, it will scale into 1 instance. And similarly, if the CPU utilization of the average of all the instances within your scale set goes above, let's say 70%, then it's going to scale up. So it's going to scale up from 1 to 2. So it's going to be an increment of always 1. So that's what we're going to try out in our example. So initially we'll have 2 instances. We'll initially scale it down to 1. And then later on we'll scale it up from 1 to 2. So let's see how this happens. So I'll see you in the console. Okay, so in our previous chapter, we had created 2 instances and the scaling that we had used was manual. So in this particular chapter, let's use custom auto scale. So let's click on custom auto scale. And what we'll do is we will create a custom auto scale based on CPU utilization. So let's imagine that your CPU utilization goes below 50%, your average CPU utilization for both the instances. Then what we will do is we will decrease the instance count by 1. And if in case the average CPU for both the instances goes above 70%, then we'll increase it by 1. So let's do that. So to do that, let's go to our scaling here. You can just click on custom auto scale. And here what you need to do is you need to scale based on a metric. And here you need to add a scale. So before doing that, let's also change the minimum. So the current minimum is 2. Let's make it as 1. And let's make the maximum as 3. And after that, let's add a rule. So the first thing that we'll do is we'll add a rule to decrease the number of instances based on the CPU utilization. So what we'll do here is we'll take the average, the metric namespace remains the same, and here you choose the percentage CPU. Of course, you can choose it based on other metrics as well, but the most commonly used one is the CPU percentage. And here it shows the current CPU average. So what I'll do is I will just change it to if it's less than or equal to 50%. And here the duration is 10 minutes. So what this duration means is that it will check the duration for your CPU utilization for the last 10 minutes. So you can increase this or decrease it based on how much you want the duration to be. And finally, the operation here is increase count by. So what we'll do is we'll decrease count by 1. And the cooldown period here specifies to the amount of time to wait after a scale operation before scaling again. So for example, if it scales down, then it waits for 5 minutes cooldown, and it's only after that the next scaling operation takes place. So let's click on add. Okay, we've done a scale in policy. Let's do a scale out policy. And this will be similar as well. So the only difference here is that I will increase count by 1, and the matrix and the average CPU utilization here should be greater than 70%. So if it's greater than 70%, then the CPU utilization increases by 1 count. And just remember that it can only increase up to a maximum of 3. So if it cannot go beyond 3. And everything else looks correct. So let's just save this. And the first thing that it should trigger is that it should trigger the scale in policy because the CPU utilization is currently less than 50%. So if I go back to the instances, what should happen is that one of the instances should get deleted, and that's precisely what's happening. So one of the instances is getting deleted and the scaling in is kicking in. That's why you'll just see one particular instance. So let's just refresh this. And you can see that just one of the instances is running right now. So the next thing that we'll do is we will simulate a situation where the CPU utilization for this goes above 70%. And once that happens, then the scale out policy will kick in and another CPU and another virtual machine will be created. So let's do that. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do is for this particular instance, we need to spike the CPU utilization. Now to do that, you can't access this particular machine via the public IP because it does not exist. So you have to access it via the private IP. Now to do that, I need to create another virtual machine that has a public IP and that is within this particular virtual network. And once I log into that machine, I can SSH into this particular machine. So let's do that. So I go to my home instance. I go to my virtual machine. Okay, so we have a virtual machine that is within the same network. So what I'll do is I will log in using the public IP address. So let's copy this and I'll be using putty to log in. And from here, I'll SSH using the public private IP address. So I go back to my scale set, instances. I'll open this instance and let's just copy this private IP. So I'll SSH into this using the private IP. Okay, so once I'm logged in, what I need to do is I need to run a command that will increase the CPU utilization. So I was able to find a command like that. So the command that I have used is this particular commands. So I'll be using this particular command to increase the CPU utilization. Now, this particular page, I will send a link in the description below. So there are other ways to do it as well. So this was the easiest way I found. So I'll just copy this and I'll paste it here. And once that happens, let's do a PS. And I can run the top command to get the CPU utilization. Now you can see that the CPU utilization has gone above 99%. So now let's wait for another instance to get created. So let's go back to our console again. Let's go to our scale set. And here you can see one new extra instance got created because of the scale out policy. So I hope this was a useful lecture. You can always try other kind of varieties as well. So currently what I had tried was the CPU utilization. You can always go and check it out for other metrics as well. So instead of using the CPU percentage, you could also use something else as well. So for example, you have a wide variety of options. You could even go for CPU credit or even data disk or some of these other options as well. So I hope this was a useful lecture. In our next lecture, we'll see on how we can scale in and scale out based on schedules. So I'll see you there.